Story 1. The Salvage Yard That Collected Futures. Raymond Tucker owned a salvage yard outside Hazard, Kentucky, specializing in automotive parts recovery from accident vehicles. He'd operated Tucker's Auto Salvage for 42 years, purchasing wrecked cars and trucks from insurance companies, stripping usable parts for resale, crushing the remains for scrap metal. It was unglamorous work that paid steadily, serving mechanics and DIY repairs across eastern Kentucky. Raymond employed 6 workers, maintained 30 acres of organized vehicle storage, and prided himself on having parts for even obscure models going back to the 1960s. His inventory system was meticulous, every vehicle cataloged by make, model, year, and date of arrival. In March 2022, Raymond purchased a lot of 12 vehicles from a regional insurance auction, standard practice for restocking inventory. The vehicles arrived on a flatbed trailer and Raymond's crew began the intake process, photographing each vehicle, documenting VIN numbers, assessing parts viability. 11 vehicles were unremarkable, typical accident damage from collisions and rollovers. But the 12th vehicle stopped Raymond cold. It was a 2027 Ford F-150 according to the manufacturer's identification plate. The styling was unfamiliar, incorporating design elements Raymond didn't recognize from current Ford models. The technology inside was advanced beyond anything Raymond had seen. Dashboard displays that activated when approached, showing interfaces that suggested full autonomous driving capability, materials that felt wrong, lighter and stronger than current automotive composites. Raymond checked the VIN against manufacturer databases. No record existed. He called the insurance company that had sold him the lot, asked about the 2027 Ford. They had no record of including any such vehicle in the sale. Raymond checked his purchase manifest. It listed only 11 vehicles. But the 12th sat in his yard, solid and undeniable, bearing a manufacturing date 5 years in the future. Raymond examined the vehicle thoroughly. The odometer showed 47,000 miles. The registration, still in the glove box, was issued in Virginia with an expiration date of June 2028. The owner's name was listed as Michael Torres with an address in Roanoke. The vehicle had been totaled in what the accident report described as a temporal collision, a term Raymond had never encountered. The report indicated Torres had been driving on Interstate 81 when his vehicle intersected with earlier timeline traffic, resulting in a collision with a vehicle that shouldn't have been in that location at that moment. Raymond tried calling the phone number listed on Torres's registration. The number didn't exist yet, showed as invalid. He tried the insurance company listed on the registration documents. No such company existed. Everything associated with the vehicle was from a future that hadn't happened yet, except the vehicle itself sat in Raymond's salvage yard, damaged but real, its parts available for removal and resale. Raymond's crew was disturbed but pragmatic. Salvage workers learned to ignore the stories behind wrecked vehicles, to focus on the mechanical task of parts recovery. They began stripping the 2027 Ford, removing the engine, transmission, body panels. The parts were incompatible with current vehicles, utilizing connection standards and electronic protocols that didn't exist yet. Raymond stored them separately, unsure what to do with components from cars that wouldn't be manufactured for 5 years. 3 weeks later, another future vehicle arrived in a lot Raymond purchased. This one was a 2029 Tesla, model designation Raymond didn't recognize, damaged in what its accident report called a causal loop collision. The driver had been involved in an accident that the report suggested had been caused by the accident itself. A temporal paradox where effect preceded cause. The vehicle contained technology even more advanced than the Ford, displays showing routes through what appeared to be 4-dimensional space rather than standard 3-dimensional geography. Raymond realized his salvage yard was somehow receiving vehicles from future timelines, cars that had been involved in accidents that wouldn't happen for years. but were manifesting in present-time insurance salvage lots. He started documenting every future vehicle carefully, photographing their technology, copying their accident reports, trying to understand the pattern. Over 6 months, he received 17 future vehicles spanning manufacturing dates from 2027 to 2034. All had been involved in temporal accidents, collisions between vehicles from different timelines occupying the same space at incompatible moments. The accident report suggested that by the late 2020s, temporal collisions would become common, that something about the way vehicles moved through space would shift, allowing them to occasionally intersect with past or future versions of the same roads. Insurance companies would develop specialized policies covering temporal accidents. Traffic laws would be amended to address situations where vehicles from different years collided. The future the vehicles came from was one where time had lost strict coherence, where driving meant risking collision not just with other contemporary vehicles, but with vehicles from yesterday or tomorrow. Raymond noticed something else. The future vehicles were appearing in his salvage yard before they arrived in the insurance lots. He'd find them in his yard in the morning, damaged and real, but the insurance company wouldn't deliver them until later that day or the next day. The vehicles were arriving at his yard directly from their accidents, bypassing normal insurance and salvage channels, manifesting in his present before officially entering it through standard commercial processes. He tested this observation by watching for vehicles that appeared overnight. On July 12th, he found a 2031 Rivian pickup in his yard at dawn. He photographed it, documented it, waited. At noon, an insurance company called to tell him they were including a anomalous vehicle in his next lot, asked if he'd accept it despite not having clear title. Raymond agreed. The delivery came on July 13th, and the vehicle on the flatbed was the same Rivian he'd found in his yard the previous morning. The vehicle existed in his yard twice, overlapping itself, the overnight version gradually fading as the officially delivered version solidified. Raymond understood his salvage yard occupied a strange position in temporal geography. It was a place where futures became solid, where vehicles from accidents that hadn't happened yet manifested before their accidents occurred. He was receiving the vehicles before they crashed, or simultaneously with their crashes or after their crashes, depending on which timeline you measured from. Time wasn't linear in his salvage yard. It was convergent, multiple timelines feeding into his 30 acres, making his inventory a collection not just of past wrecks, but future wrecks, vehicles damaged in accidents from years ahead. His workers started experiencing disorientation. They'd strip parts from a vehicle, then find the vehicle intact again the next morning, requiring them to strip it again. They'd remove an engine, store it in the warehouse, and the same engine would appear in a different vehicle weeks later, before the vehicle it came from had arrived. Parts were looping, existing in multiple states, being removed and installed simultaneously in different temporal contexts. Raymond tried to sell the future parts. He listed them online, describing them accurately. Parts from 2027-2034 vehicles, advanced technology, incompatible with current models but potentially valuable for research. He received inquiries from organizations he'd never heard of, government agencies that didn't officially exist, research institutions with no public presence. They offered extraordinary prices, asking for complete vehicles if Raymond had them, willing to pay 6 figures for wrecked cars from timelines that hadn't manifested yet. Raymond sold 3 vehicles to these buyers. They arrived with specialized transport equipment, loaded the future wrecks carefully, provided payment in cryptocurrency that immediately converted to standard currency at rates that suggested the cryptocurrency hadn't been invented yet, but would be worth exactly what they paid him once it was. The buyers asked Raymond to notify them of any additional future vehicles, provided contact numbers that worked despite being from area codes that didn't exist. But the sales had consequences. After removing 3 vehicles from his yard, Raymond noticed the salvage yard itself was becoming unstable. Vehicles would shift positions overnight, rearranging themselves in patterns Raymond didn't create. His organized inventory was becoming chaotic, past and future vehicles mixing randomly, parts from different eras combining in ways that suggested the yard's temporal boundaries were dissolving. Raymond's crew started seeing people in the yard at night, figures wearing clothing from different decades, walking among the wrecked vehicles, sometimes climbing into them and sitting as if waiting for something. The figures were translucent, not quite solid, and they didn't respond to shouting or approach. They existed in the salvage yard, but not in present time. Ghosts from various timelines, possibly the drivers who died in the vehicles Raymond had purchased, possibly future visitors coming back to the point where their timelines converged. Raymond stopped accepting salvage lots. He closed his business to new inventory, tried to stabilize what he had. But future vehicles continued appearing overnight, manifesting directly in his yard without any purchase or delivery. His yard was becoming a collection point for temporal accidents across multiple decades, a place where vehicles from crashes throughout the 2020s and 2030s were appearing simultaneously, creating a salvage yard that existed in superposition, containing inventory from years that hadn't happened yet, and years that were currently happening, and years that had already passed, all occupying the same 30 acres outside Hazard, Kentucky. Raymond lives on the property now, maintaining a watch, documenting the vehicles that appear, trying to understand the pattern. He's given up on selling parts or operating a business. His salvage yard has become something else, a temporal collection point, a place where the future crashes into the present literally, where vehicles from accidents that will happen arrive before or during or after their accidents depending on perspective. He's the curator of an impossible inventory, a salvage operator who receives wrecks from timelines that haven't solidified yet, and he knows eventually he'll receive his own vehicle, the car he'll be driving when he has the accident that sends him back to his own salvage yard, creating a loop where Raymond Tucker becomes inventory in the business he built. Another damaged vehicle sitting among hundreds, waiting for a version of himself from a different timeline to strip for parts and wonder why this particular wreck feels so familiar. Why sitting in the driver's seat produces memories of owning a salvage yard where futures accumulated, and the line between collecting vehicles and becoming collected dissolved until Raymond couldn't tell if he was the salvage operator or the salvage, the person who received wrecked cars from tomorrow, or the person who crashed yesterday and arrived today, and the question stopped mattering because in a yard where time converges, every role exists simultaneously, and Raymond Tucker is both operator and inventory, both living and wrecked, both present and future, sitting among vehicles that represent every accident he'll ever have across all timelines, waiting for the moment when his current timeline intersects with the accident that will send him back to this yard where he's been waiting since before he arrived. Story 2. The weather station that forecast yesterday. Melissa Cordero worked as a meteorologist for the National Weather Service, assigned to the forecast office in Blacksburg, Virginia, covering weather prediction for southwestern Virginia and portions of West Virginia. She'd been with NWS for 11 years, held degrees in atmospheric science and climatology, and specialized in severe weather forecasting for Appalachian terrain, where mountains created complex localized weather patterns. Her work involved analyzing data from weather stations, satellites, and radar systems, then producing forecasts and warnings that protected lives and property across her forecast area. In April 2021, Melissa noticed anomalies in data from a mountaintop weather station designated as Site VW47, located on a ridge in Tazewell County at approximately 4,200 feet elevation. The station was automated, collecting temperature, pressure, humidity, wind speed, and precipitation data every 15 minutes, transmitting via radio to the Blacksburg office. The data from VW47 had always been reliable, helping Melissa understand how weather systems moved through the region's complex topography. The anomalies started subtle. VW47's data would occasionally arrive delayed. Transmissions that should have come every 15 minutes instead arriving every 30 or 45 minutes, with gaps suggesting signal interference or equipment malfunction. But when the delayed data arrived, it was perfect, matching conditions that Melissa observed. Not matching conditions at the moment of reception, but matching conditions from hours earlier, as if the station was reporting accurate data but transmitting it with significant lag. Melissa filed maintenance requests. Technicians visited VW47, tested the equipment, replaced the transmission system. The station passed all diagnostics, showed no hardware faults. But the delays continued and worsened. Data that should have been real-time was arriving hours late, then days late. By June, VW47 was transmitting weather data from 72 hours previous. The station was forecasting backward, reporting yesterday's weather as if it were happening now. Melissa studied the pattern carefully. The station wasn't malfunctioning exactly, it was reporting accurate data but temporally displaced. Every measurement was correct for the time it claimed to represent, just offset by 3 days. Temperature, pressure, precipitation all matched historical records perfectly when corrected for the temporal offset. The station was functioning perfectly but existing in a different time frame than the rest of the weather monitoring network. Melissa tried using the offset data as historical verification. If VW47 was reporting 3 days behind, she could check its current readings against what actually happened 3 days ago, confirming the accuracy. The correlation was perfect. Whatever VW47 transmitted today had actually occurred exactly 72 hours earlier. The station was receiving weather from the past and reporting it as present. Then the offset changed. In July, VW47's data started arriving early. Instead of lagging 3 days behind, it began leading 3 days ahead. The station reported a severe thunderstorm on July 15th at 2:01 p.m. Melissa checked radar and satellite. No storm. Clear skies over Tazewell County. But 72 hours later, on July 18th at exactly 2:00 p.m., a severe thunderstorm developed over Tazewell County, matching VW47's earlier report perfectly. Wind speed, rainfall rate, lightning frequency all matched what the station had reported 3 days before it happened. Melissa realized she had a station that was forecasting the future by reporting it as present. VW47 had somehow become temporally displaced, existing 3 days ahead of consensus time, experiencing weather before it happened and transmitting those observations back to present time. She had a perfect 72-hour forecast for the specific location of VW47, accurate in every detail because it wasn't predicting the weather but observing it from the future. Melissa tested the data extensively before reporting to her supervisors. She compared VW47's readings against actual conditions 3 days later for a full month. Perfect correlation. Every forecast verified, every detail matched. The station was observing future weather and transmitting it to present-time meteorologists. She documented her findings and submitted them to NWS management, expecting skepticism but hoping for serious investigation. Management's response was dismissal. They concluded Melissa was misinterpreting data artifacts, that VW47 had a malfunction causing it to retransmit stored historical data randomly, creating the illusion of temporal displacement. They ordered the station decommissioned, removed from the official observation network. Melissa argued for keeping it operational, for studying the phenomenon, but her arguments were rejected. VW47 was shut down in September 2021, its data stream terminated. Melissa couldn't let it go. She obtained permission to visit VW47 personally, to examine the site and understand what was causing the temporal displacement. She hiked to the mountaintop station in October, reaching the small fenced enclosure that housed the instruments. Everything appeared normal. Anemometer spinning in the wind. Rain gauge collecting the light precipitation falling that afternoon. Temperature probe properly shielded. But standing at the site, Melissa felt wrong. Time felt wrong. Her movements seemed delayed, as if she was moving through medium more resistant than air. She checked. Her phone. No signal expected at this remote location. But her phone's clock was malfunctioning, running fast, gaining minutes even as she watched. She checked her watch. Also running fast, accelerating. She'd arrived at 2 p.m. according to the time when she started hiking. Her watch now showed 5 p.m., but the sun's position suggested only an hour had passed. She was experiencing time dilation, moving through time faster than the surrounding world, living through hours and minutes. Melissa left the station and descended the mountain. As she hiked down, her watch and phone gradually synchronized back to normal time. By the time she reached her car at the trailhead, her devices showed correct time again, as if the 3 hours they'd gained on the mountaintop had never happened. But Melissa's body had experienced those hours. She was hungry, tired, as if she'd been hiking for much longer than the afternoon jaunt her position suggested. She understood. VW-47 sat in a location where time moved faster than surrounding areas. The mountaintop existed in a temporal gradient, experiencing time at an accelerated rate, living through days while the valleys below lived through hours. The weather station, existing in this accelerated time frame, observed weather that hadn't reached lower elevations yet, weather that was happening at the mountaintop's accelerated rate but wouldn't manifest at normal elevations until days later. The station wasn't predicting the future. It was observing its own present, which was everyone else's future. Melissa researched the site's history. The ridge where VW-47 stood had a reputation in local folklore. Cherokee oral tradition spoke of it as a fast mountain, a place where seasons changed quickly, where people who climbed it would age rapidly, where time didn't flow at the same rate as the surrounding valleys. Early settlers had avoided building near the ridge, considering it cursed or haunted. Modern hikers occasionally reported disorientation near the summit, feeling like they'd spent days on the mountain when only hours had passed. Melissa tried to publish her findings. Academic journals rejected her papers, considering her conclusions too extraordinary to accept without evidence stronger than what she could provide. She tried to restart VW-47 to use it as proof of the temporal gradient, but NWS refused to reactivate the station. Her obsession with the anomaly was affecting her job performance, her supervisors warned. She needed to focus on standard forecasting, stop pursuing theories about time-displaced weather stations. Melissa took leave from her position. She installed her own weather equipment near VW-47, placing instruments at various elevations on the ridge, documenting the temporal gradient. She found that time acceleration increased with elevation. At 3,000 feet, time ran normally. At 3,500 feet, approximately 10% fast. At 4,000 feet, 50% fast. At VW-47's elevation of 4,200 feet, time ran at triple normal rate, 3 days passing for every day at sea level. She tried to warn people about the gradient, about the danger of spending extended time at elevation on this particular ridge. But her warnings were dismissed as the obsessions of a meteorologist who'd had a breakdown. Hikers continued visiting the area, most experiencing only minor disorientation that they attributed to altitude or exertion. But occasionally someone would hike to the summit and disappear, simply not descend. Search teams would find no trace. Melissa knew what happened to them. They'd spent too long in the accelerated time frame, aged years in the hours they experienced, and their bodies couldn't handle the rapid biological acceleration. Or they'd become trapped in the gradient, unable to transition back to normal time, continuing to exist at the mountaintop's accelerated rate, living and dying in the span of days that felt like years to them but were only hours to searchers operating in normal time. Melissa returned to VW-47 in spring 2022. She brought supplies for a week, intending to document her experience of time dilation thoroughly. She climbed to the station, set up her equipment, began recording. The first day passed quickly by her perception, but slowly by the world's clock. She experienced dawn, noon, dusk, and another dawn in what her watch showed as 8 hours. She was living through 3 days for every standard day. Her supplies were depleting rapidly. Food she'd brought for a week was gone in 2 days of her experience, which was less than a day external time. She realized she was trapped in the same situation as the missing hikers. Descending required moving from fast time to slow time, a transition that her body might not handle if she'd been in the gradient too long. She'd aged almost a week biologically, while less than 2 days had passed externally. The stress of rapid resynchronization could stop her heart, stroke her brain, kill her. Melissa made camp at VW-47, living in the accelerated time frame, aging 3 times faster than the world below. She continued documenting weather, recording observations that predicted the future for lower elevations because she was experiencing that future at her accelerated rate. She transmitted her data using amateur radio equipment, sending weather observations to meteorologists who didn't know they were receiving forecasts from a colleague trapped in fast time. She lived for 17 years in that accelerated time frame, aging from 34 to 51, experiencing over 6,000 days while the world below experienced less than 2,000 days. She documented weather patterns, studied the temporal gradient, tried to understand the mechanism. She concluded that the ridge sat above a geological anomaly, possibly a deposit of radioactive material or a crystalline formation that affected local space-time, creating a field where time moved faster, where the mountain lived through seasons more quickly than the valleys surrounding it. Melissa descended finally in 2028 by external calendar, though she'd experienced time equivalent to 2045. She was 51 years old externally, approaching 70 internally, her body showing the wear of accelerated aging. She'd spent 6 external years on the mountain, living through 18 years of subjective experience, watching weather patterns that wouldn't manifest at normal elevations for days or weeks or months after she observed them. She died in 2030, aged 53 externally but 72 by biological measures. Her journals, recovered from VW-47, documented in precise detail the weather of southwestern Virginia from 2022 through 2045. Observations made in real time from a mountaintop that exists 23 years ahead of the valleys below. Meteorologists who study her work find her forecasts accurate for years beyond her external death date. She documented hurricanes that will hit the region in 2035, droughts that will affect the area in 2038, weather patterns that haven't happened yet but will happen exactly as she recorded because she lived through them in fast time, while the rest of the world moved through them in standard time. VW-47 remains decommissioned, the instruments silent, but the ridge continues accelerating time for anyone who climbs high enough, continues running fast, continues existing in the future while the present moves slowly below, and Melissa Cordero's ghost, if ghosts exist in accelerated time, continues documenting weather that hasn't happened yet. Continues transmitting observations from a mountaintop that lives in tomorrow while the rest of Virginia lives in today. And occasionally meteorologists receive transmissions on old frequencies, weather data that shows impossible future dates, reports from a station that should be silent from a meteorologist who should be dead, except death and silence are concepts that apply to linear time. And time on that ridge isn't linear, it's accelerated, running ahead, pulling the future into the present, and Melissa exists there still, aging rapidly, living years and days, watching weather patterns unfold in fast forward. The meteorologist who became her own forecast, the woman who predicted the future by living it faster than everyone else and reporting back from the mountaintop where tomorrow is today and today was yesterday, and time flows like wind up the ridge, accelerating, pulling anyone who climbs high enough into fast-forward existence where the rest of your life happens in the span of days and you watch the world age slowly below while you race ahead, becoming older, becoming forecast, becoming the warning about what happens when you spend too long measuring the weather from a place where time itself is the weather, unpredictable and dangerous and moving at speeds that human biology wasn't designed to handle. Story 3. The campground where tents multiplied. Robert Desmond managed a campground in the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee, a popular site for hikers and families accessing the Appalachian Trail and nearby waterfalls. The campground featured 38 campsites arranged in loops through mature forest, with bathhouses, a camp store, and ranger residence where Robert lived year-round. He'd been managing the site for 15 years, maintaining facilities, collecting fees, enforcing regulations, helping occasional visitors who encountered problems with weather or wildlife. It was steady work, serving a steady flow of outdoor enthusiasts who appreciated the campground's natural setting and Robert's professional maintenance. The multiplication started in June 2019. Robert was conducting his morning rounds, checking sites, when he noticed Site 17 had 2 tents. He checked his registration log. Site 17 was occupied by the Morrison family, party of 4, 1 tent. But 2 tents sat on the site, both set up properly, both showing signs of occupancy. Robert approached and called out. A woman emerged from one tent, identified herself as Mrs. Morrison. Robert asked about the second tent. She looked confused, said they'd brought only 1 tent, gestured to the tent she'd emerged from. Robert pointed to the second tent, 3 feet away. Mrs. Morrison looked genuinely surprised, said that tent hadn't been there when her family went to sleep the previous night. Robert examined the second tent. It was identical to the Morrison tent, same brand, same color, same wear patterns. Inside, he found camping gear identical to the Morrison's equipment. Sleeping bags, backpacks, coolers, all duplicates. Mrs. Morrison confirmed the items looked like theirs, but insisted they hadn't brought duplicates, couldn't afford duplicates, had no explanation for the second tent. Robert documented the incident, asked the Morrisons to pack up the duplicate tent when they departed. They left the next morning, taking both tents, confused but cooperative. Robert dismissed the incident as a misunderstanding. Perhaps friends camping nearby who'd set up in the wrong site. But the multiplications continued. Site 23, occupied by a solo camper, showed 2 tents the next morning. Site 8, occupied by a couple, showed 3 tents. Site 31, occupied by a youth group, showed 17 tents instead of the 8 they'd registered. In every case, campers insisted they'd brought only the original tents, that the duplicates had appeared overnight, identical to their originals down to the smallest details. Robert investigated for theft or pranks, but the duplicate tents and equipment were exact copies, not similar items stolen from storage or purchased to match. Every seam, every stain, every repair on the duplicates matched the originals perfectly. These weren't stolen tents being planted in sites. These were the same tents existing in multiple instances, multiplied somehow overnight. The pattern intensified. By July, every occupied campsite was multiplying its contents. Tents doubled, tripled, sometimes increasing tenfold overnight. Camping equipment duplicated. Vehicles in parking areas would show duplicates in adjacent spaces, identical down to license plates and minor dents. Campers themselves began reporting strange experiences, waking up seeing multiple versions of their tent mates sleeping in duplicated sleeping bags, hearing conversations from the duplicate tents, conversations they remembered having earlier. Robert contacted Cherokee National Forest Administration, reported the phenomenon. Officials visited, witnessed the multiplications, documented them with photographs and reports. The campground was closed temporarily for investigation. Experts from various fields examined the site, geologists checking for unusual mineral deposits, physicists measuring electromagnetic fields, biologists testing for fungal or bacterial contamination that might cause hallucinations. They found anomalies. The campground sat above a fault line where two geological formations met, creating a junction of rock types deposited in different eras. Ground-penetrating radar showed unusual structures beneath the campground, possibly natural caverns or possibly something else. Geometric patterns that suggested organization rather than random natural formation. Electromagnetic measurements showed fluctuations that correlated with the multiplications, spikes in local field strength overnight when new tents appeared. The campground reopened in August with warnings posted. Unusual phenomena reported. Camp at own risk. Report anomalies to management. Most campers avoided the site, but some were attracted by the weirdness, wanted to experience the multiplications firsthand. Robert allowed them to stay, documenting their experiences carefully. A group of college students camping in September reported the most detailed account. They set up 4 tents, settled in for the evening, went to sleep around midnight. At 2 a.m., one student woke to use the bathhouse. He counted 12 tents around their campfire, all identical to their original 4, arranged in a circle. He woke his friends. They explored the duplicate tents and found versions of themselves sleeping inside, identical duplicates living through the same camping trip simultaneously. The students tried communicating with their duplicates, shouting, shaking, trying to wake them. The duplicates didn't respond, continued sleeping or engaged in camping activities without acknowledging the originals. The students were ghosts to their duplicates, or the duplicates were ghosts to them, both existing in the same space but unable to interact. By dawn, the duplicate tents had vanished. Only the original 4 remained, but the students all reported feeling wrong, feeling like they might have been duplicates themselves, like maybe they'd vanished and the versions that remained were the copies, not the originals. How could they tell? If duplicates were perfect, identical in every way, including memories, there was no method to distinguish original from copy. Robert started noticing the effect spreading beyond the campground. The forest surrounding the site was showing duplications, trees appearing in double hiking trails splitting into multiple paths that all led to the same destination, creeks running in parallel channels that occasionally intersected. The multiplication wasn't limited to camping equipment, it was affecting the landscape itself. He hiked into the forest to investigate. A mile from the campground, he found a section where the multiplication was visible in progress. Trees existed in superposition, occupying the same space but slightly offset, like viewing double through unfocused eyes. Rocks sat in duplicate, one solid and one translucent. The trail split into 5 versions, all occupying nearly the same path but diverging slightly in different dimensions. Robert realized the campground sat on a location where reality was unstable, where the quantum superposition that physics said existed at microscopic scales was manifesting at macroscopic scale. Everything existed in multiple states simultaneously, and those states were becoming independently observable instead of collapsing into single states when observed. Campers were seeing their tents multiply because the tents existed in multiple quantum states, and the campground's anomaly was making all those states visible simultaneously. He tried to explain this to forest administrators. They didn't understand or didn't believe. They closed the campground permanently in October 2019, citing safety concerns and inability to maintain operations in an area with unexplained phenomena. Robert was reassigned to different facility. The campground was fenced, marked as closed indefinitely, but the multiplication continued. Robert, now living 20 miles away, started noticing duplications in his new location. His belongings would multiply overnight. His car would appear in his driveway twice, identical copies. He'd see versions of himself in mirrors, not reflections, but independent versions occupying slightly different positions. He realized he'd been affected by the campground's anomaly, had absorbed whatever field caused the multiplications, was now carrying it with him. The duplications spread through his new community. Neighbors reported seeing multiple versions of their houses, of their families, of themselves. The anomaly wasn't contained to the campground. It was mobile, spreading through Robert like an infection, affecting everyone he encountered. Within 6 months, the entire town was experiencing multiplications, living in superposition, existing in multiple states simultaneously. Robert isolated himself, moved to a remote cabin, tried to contain the spread. But isolation didn't stop the effect. He continued multiplying, seeing versions of himself engaged in different activities, splitting into possibilities rather than collapsing into single outcomes. He was becoming quantum at macroscopic scale, existing in every possible state simultaneously, unable to collapse into definite existence. He documented his experience for as long as coherence remained. The last entries in his journal describe existing as hundreds of versions simultaneously, each living slightly different lives, making slightly different choices, all aware of each other, all competing for consensus reality. He described the experience as fragmenting, losing sense of which version was original, losing sense of whether original even mattered when all versions were equally real and equally valid. Robert Desmond disappeared from consensus reality in March 2021. His cabin was found empty, his possessions multiplied into thousands of versions filling every room. His journal ending with increasingly fragmented entries suggesting consciousness distributed across infinite possible states. The town where he'd lived briefly experienced multiplicative effects for another year before stabilizing. The anomaly fading gradually, reality collapsing back into definite states. But the campground remains closed, the anomaly still active. Hikers who venture past the fences report seeing multiple versions of the forest overlapping, seeing themselves walking the same trails in duplicate or triplicate, seeing reality split into branches that all exist simultaneously. The Cherokee National Forest officially attributes the closure to landslide risk and soil instability. But the real reason is that reality itself is unstable there. That quantum superposition that should exist only in physics textbooks manifests visibly in that location that anyone who camps there risks fragmenting into multiple versions. Risks losing the coherence that makes you singular rather than plural. Risks discovering that the version of you sleeping in your tent might not be the only version, might not be the original version, might not be the version that wakes up when morning comes and the other versions vanish, because in the campground where tents multiply, you multiply too, and there's no method to determine which multiplication is the real you, which will persist and which will vanish with the morning. Whether you're the version typing these words or the version reading them or one of infinite versions existing in superposition, all equally real, all equally certain you're the original. All slowly realizing that original is meaningless when every version has identical memories and identical claim to continuity. And the campground waits in the Cherokee National Forest, fenced and closed, multiplying in the darkness, creating infinite versions of itself, of the trees surrounding it, of anyone foolish enough to pitch their tent in a location where reality admits it's never been singular, where everything exists in multiple states simultaneously. And the only thing that changed when the anomaly manifested was visibility, was that the multiplicities we've always existed in became observable, became undeniable, became the truth that destroys the comfortable fiction of definite singular existence we rely on to function without fragmenting into the infinite possible versions of ourselves. We're always becoming, always splitting into, always multiplying across the quantum foam that underlies the illusion we call consensus reality, but is really just the version we agree to observe while all other versions continue existing unseen in the campground where every tent is many tents and every camper is many campers and Robert Desmond is many Roberts scattered across possibility space. All writing journals that end with the same fragmenting awareness that singularity was always a lie. And multiplication is truth. Story 4. The pawn shop that sold memories. Gerald Blackwood owned a pawn shop in Pikeville, Kentucky, operating out of a storefront on Main Street that had housed various retail establishments since the building's construction in 1947. Gerald had purchased the business in 2003, inheriting inventory and customer base from the previous owner who'd retired. The pawn business was steady in eastern Kentucky, serving people who needed short-term loans collateralized by possessions they'd reclaim after a few months. Gerald loaned money on jewelry, electronics, tools, musical instruments, firearms, anything with resale value. Most customers redeemed their items, but occasionally merchandise went unclaimed and Gerald would sell it, recovering his loan amount plus modest profit. The memory items started appearing in January 2020. Gerald opened the shop one morning and found 3 objects on the counter that he didn't recognize: a pocket watch, a fountain pen, and a leather-bound notebook. No intake paperwork accompanied them, no pawn tickets indicating who'd brought them, no records in Gerald's system. He assumed his part-time employee had accepted them late previous evening and failed to complete paperwork. But when Gerald asked, his employee claimed ignorance, said he'd locked up the shop at closing with the counter clear. Gerald examined the objects. The pocket watch was gold-plated brass, manufactured around 1920 based on the style and maker's mark. The fountain pen was a Parker model from the 1950s, well-used but functional. The notebook was empty, pages blank, leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. All 3 objects were ordinary antiques with modest value. Gerald priced them for resale, displayed them in the case. A customer purchased the pocket watch that afternoon. Gerald completed the transaction, watched the customer leave. An hour later, the customer returned, confused and disturbed. He said the pocket watch was wrong, that when he held it, he experienced memories that weren't his. He described growing up in a coal camp in the 1930s, working underground at age 14, marrying young, dying in a mine collapse in 1944. The memories were vivid, detailed, felt absolutely real while he held the watch. When he set it down, the memories faded, but the sense of having lived someone else's life remained. He wanted to return the watch, get his money back. Gerald accepted the return, disturbed by the customer's account. He handled the watch himself, holding it carefully. Immediately, memories flooded his consciousness. Not his memories, but someone else's. He experienced childhood in a time before he was born, in a place he'd never lived. He felt the weight of a pickaxe in his hands, felt coal dust in his lungs, felt love for a woman whose face he shouldn't know. When Gerald released the watch, the memories withdrew like water draining, leaving only residual impressions. Gerald tested the other items. The fountain pen carried different memories. A teacher's memories from the 1960s, decades of teaching English literature in a high school that had been demolished in the 1980s. The notebook contained memories of a minister, sermons preached, congregants counseled, decades of religious service encoded somehow in the blank pages. The objects weren't ordinary antiques. They were memory storage containing the experiences of their former owners, accessible to anyone who handled them. Gerald researched the phenomenon, found scattered references in folklore to objects that absorbed their owners' histories, that retained psychic impressions. But these weren't vague impressions or feelings. These were complete memories, detailed and vivid, allowing the person holding the object to experience years of someone else's life in minutes. More memory objects appeared in Gerald's shop. Every few days he'd find new items on the counter, none accompanied by paperwork or explanation. A wedding ring containing a woman's memories of marriage from the 1940s through her death in 1995. A harmonica containing a musician's memories of traveling through Appalachia playing folk music in the Depression era. A Bible containing a preacher's memories spanning 60 years of ministry. Gerald realized his pawn shop was becoming a collection point for these objects, a place where memory-encoded possessions manifested or were delivered by processes he didn't understand. He started cataloging them carefully, documenting which object contained whose memories, creating an archive of lived experiences encoded in everyday items. He tried to identify the original owners through the memories themselves. The pocket watch belonged to Thomas McCoy Minor, born 1906, died 1944. Gerald found McCoy's death certificate confirmed the dates matched. The fountain pen belonged to Helen Pritchard, teacher, born 1924, died 2003. The wedding ring belonged to Dorothy Sutton, housewife, born 1921, died 1995. Every memory object contained authentic life stories of real people, their entire experiential histories compressed into the physical items they'd owned. Gerald experimented with the objects, spending hours experiencing other people's lives. He lived through childhoods in the early 1900s, young adulthoods during the Depression, military service in World War II, careers in industries that no longer existed. He gained skills and knowledge from the memories, learned to play instruments, speak phrases in languages he'd never studied, recognized faces of people who died before he was born. But the memories had effects Gerald hadn't anticipated. After experiencing someone else's life, returning to his own felt wrong. His memories seemed less vivid, less real. He'd catch himself thinking in the patterns of the people whose memories he'd accessed, using their vocabularies, holding their opinions. He was accumulating other people's experiences, but those experiences were overwriting his own identity, making him a composite of everyone whose memories he'd accessed. Gerald's personality began fragmenting. He'd respond to his name sometimes and not respond other times, confused about which name applied to him. He'd reference events from the memory objects as if he'd personally experienced them, mixing others' histories with his own timeline. His employee noticed the changes, suggested Gerald take time off, see a doctor. But Gerald couldn't stop. He was addicted to the memory objects, to the experience of living multiple lives, to the knowledge and experiences they contained. New objects continued appearing. Gerald's collection grew to over 200 memory-encoded items spanning lives from the 1880s through the 2010s. He'd spent thousands of hours experiencing other people's memories, living through centuries of combined experience, accumulating knowledge and skills from dozens of different people. He knew coal mining techniques from the 1920s, teaching methods from the 1960s, farming practices from the 1890s, recipes from the 1950s. He was becoming an archive of Appalachian life, a repository of experiences from across generations. But Gerald Blackwood as an individual was disappearing. The memories he'd accessed were overwriting his original identity, replacing his experiences with theirs until he couldn't distinguish which memories were authentically his and which he'd absorbed from objects. He'd lost coherent sense of self, existed as a composite consciousness containing fragments of 200 people, all competing for dominance in a single mind not designed to hold multiple lifetimes. His employee found him in the shop in December 2021, sitting among the memory objects, holding several simultaneously, experiencing multiple lives concurrently. Gerald didn't respond to his name, didn't recognize his employee, couldn't explain who he was or what he was doing. He'd fragmented completely, consciousness distributed across the memory objects, existing simultaneously as Thomas McCoy and Helen Pritchard and Dorothy Sutton and 200 others, unable to integrate the experiences, unable to return to singular identity. Gerald was hospitalized, diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder or schizophrenia depending on which psychiatrist evaluated him. Medications reduced the symptoms but couldn't restore his original personality. He'd been overwritten by the memories his original self lost beneath layers of other people's experiences. He lives in a care facility now, sometimes responding to Gerald, sometimes to Thomas or Helen or Dorothy, sometimes to names of people whose memory objects were in his shop, existing as a fluctuating composite. A person who tried to experience too many lives and lost the one life that was originally his. The pawn shop closed. Gerald's family liquidated the inventory, selling everything to pay his medical expenses. The memory objects were sold as ordinary antiques, dispersed to collectors and second-hand stores across the region. Whoever purchased them would handle them, experience the memories, risk the same fragmentation Gerald experienced if they spent too long accessing other people's lives. The objects continue circulating. Occasionally, someone posts online about a strange antique that causes vivid false memories when touched. Occasionally, someone develops unexplained skills, suddenly knows how to do things they never learned, speaks phrases in languages they don't speak, from handling an object that belonged to someone who had those skills decades ago. The memory objects persist, spreading through Appalachia's antique markets and estate sales, carrying the lived experiences of people long dead, waiting for someone to handle them and access the memories within. Gerald Blackwood's story serves as warning about what happens when you experience too many lives, when you absorb too many memories that aren't yours, when you lose track of which experiences belong to your original timeline. Memory is what makes us continuous across time, what makes us recognizable as ourselves from childhood to death. But memory is also fragile, vulnerable to overwriting, and the memory objects prove that experiences can be transferred, can be absorbed, can replace original memories with imported histories until the person who started handling the objects no longer exists except as substrate for other people's lives. And Gerald sits in his care facility room holding objects that don't contain memories because his hands have absorbed them all, integrated them into his fragmented consciousness, made him into a living archive of Appalachian experience spanning over a century. 200 people's lives compressed into one failing mind, and he'll die eventually, probably soon. And when he dies, what happens to all those memories he absorbed? Do they die with him, erasing 200 people's experiences permanently? Or do they return to the objects waiting for the next person foolish enough to hold a pocket watch or fountain pen or wedding ring and discover that the previous owner's entire life is accessible through that contact, available to experience, easy to access, difficult to escape, impossible to forget once you've lived someone else's joys and sorrows and mundane days and you realize your memories aren't more real than theirs. Your life isn't more valid, and the boundary between you and them is just agreement that your memories belong to you. But that agreement is revocable, is vulnerable, is threatened every time you handle an object that remembers more clearly than you do. Story 5. The veterinarian who treated impossible animals. Dr. Hannah Reeves operated a veterinary clinic in Boone, North Carolina, serving pets and livestock across Watauga County. She'd graduated from NC State's veterinary program in 2009, completed an internship in emergency and critical care, then opened her own practice in 2012. The clinic was small, just Hannah and 2 veterinary technicians, but well-equipped to handle the range of cases rural practice provided. Routine wellness exams, surgical procedures, emergency treatment for injuries and acute illnesses. Hannah specialized in large animals, making farm calls for cattle, horses, and goats. But her clinic treated everything from hamsters to horses, The impossible animals started appearing in March 2021. Hannah's first case was brought in by a farmer named Pete Garrison, who carried a cardboard box into the exam room and asked Hannah to look at his dog. Hannah opened the box and found an animal that resembled a dog but was anatomically wrong. The skeleton was visible through translucent skin, but the bone structure didn't match canine anatomy. Too many ribs, joints in wrong locations, skull shape that suggested no breed Hannah recognized. The animal was alive, breathing, watching her with eyes that had vertical pupils instead of round. Hannah asked Pete where he'd gotten this animal. Pete insisted it was his dog, that he'd owned it for 5 years, that it had always looked like this. Hannah examined the creature carefully. It responded like a dog, wagged its tail-like appendage, licked her hand with a tongue that had too many sections. But its internal anatomy was impossible. Heart in the wrong location, lungs arranged differently, organs Hannah couldn't identify serving functions she couldn't determine. She treated the animal for the symptoms Pete described. The symptoms were normal: ear infection, manageable with standard antibiotics. But the anatomy was completely abnormal, suggesting this creature wasn't a dog or any terrestrial species, was something else wearing approximately dog-shaped form. Pete thanked her, paid, left with his dog, never acknowledging that anything was unusual. More impossible animals followed. A cat with too many legs, folded beneath it when resting, unfolding for movement in geometries that violated normal physics. A horse with translucent organs visible through gaps in its solid exterior, heart and lungs operating in rhythms that shouldn't sustain life. A chicken that flickered, existing in multiple locations simultaneously, occupying a quantum superposition visible to naked eye. Hannah documented every case, photographing the animals, recording her examinations. The owners were uniformly unable to acknowledge their pet's impossibility. They described normal animals, normal breeds, normal behaviors. They brought them for normal veterinary care, vaccinations, wellness exams, treatment for common ailments. But the animals themselves were abnormal, anatomically impossible, biologically incoherent. Hannah tested her own perception. Was she hallucinating? Experiencing neurological dysfunction? She had her technicians examine the animals independently. They confirmed Hannah's observations. The animals were impossible, but the owners didn't perceive the impossibility. Some cognitive disconnect allowed owners to see their pets as normal while veterinary staff saw the truth. Hannah researched similar cases, found scattered reports from other veterinarians encountering animals that didn't match known species, that had anatomies contradicting biological principles. Most vets dismiss these as genetic abnormalities or misperceptions. But Hannah's cases were too consistent, too frequent, suggesting not isolated abnormalities but a pattern, a category of animals that existed in Appalachia despite being biologically impossible. She developed a theory. These animals were extradimensional, species from realities where biology operated under different rules, where anatomy could be arranged in ways Earth biology didn't allow. They'd crossed into our dimension, manifested in approximately familiar forms, close enough to dogs and cats and horses that people could accept them as pets without consciously recognizing the wrongness. But veterinarians trained to understand normal anatomy could see the discrepancies, could recognize these animals weren't from our biological paradigm. Hannah tried to communicate her theory to the owners. She'd explain gently that their pet's anatomy was unusual, that she'd never seen this configuration before. Owners would smile politely and repeat that their pet was normal, just a regular dog or cat or horse, nothing unusual. The cognitive disconnect was absolute. Owners couldn't perceive or acknowledge their pet's impossibility, even when Hannah showed them X-rays revealing skeletons that couldn't exist. Hannah became known locally as the vet who would treat any animal, no matter how unusual. Farmers brought her livestock that defied classification, pets that flickered between states, animals that existed partially in visible spectrum and partially in wavelengths. Hannah's eyes couldn't detect, but her instruments could measure. She treated them all, adapting veterinary medicine to accommodate anatomies that shouldn't work, providing care to animals from dimensions where biology had evolved along different principles. The animals were generally healthy by their own standards, just incompatible with Earth biology in ways that made diagnosis challenging. Hannah learned to infer function from form, to understand that organs she couldn't identify might serve purposes terrestrial animals achieve differently. She developed new diagnostic techniques, new treatment protocols, creating a veterinary medicine adapted to extradimensional biology. But the work affected Hannah's perception. She started seeing impossibilities everywhere, not just in the animals, but in people. She'd look at clients and see their anatomies flickering, revealing skeletons that didn't quite match human structure, organs arranged slightly wrong as if humans themselves were extra-dimensional, were approximating a form rather than naturally possessing it. Hannah became convinced that reality in Appalachia was thinner than elsewhere, that the boundary between dimensions was permeable, that animals and possibly people could cross between realities, existing partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The mountains were old, had existed through geological eras when Earth's biology was radically different, and those eras had left marks, had created weak points where the past or alternate presence could bleed through. She tried to publish her findings. Veterinary journals rejected her papers, considered her observations delusional or fraudulent. She tried to show colleagues the impossible animals, but most couldn't see the impossibility, experienced the same cognitive disconnect as the owners. Only a few veterinarians, seemingly at random, could perceive the anatomical wrongness, could recognize these animals as extra-dimensional. Hannah theorized that perception of impossibility required specific cognitive flexibility, an ability to accept evidence contradicting learned patterns. Most people's minds would reject impossible anatomy, would rationalize it as normal rather than accept the implications. But some people, Hannah included, lacked whatever mental filter allowed that rationalization, saw the impossibility directly, couldn't unsee it once perceived. The impossible animals continued arriving at her clinic. By 2023, Hannah estimated 30% of her patients were extra-dimensional, were animals from realities where biology operated under different rules. She treated them alongside terrestrial animals, provided care across dimensional boundaries, became the veterinarian who served not just Watauga County but the multiple versions of Watauga County that overlapped it from adjacent dimensions. Hannah still practices, still operates her clinic, though her reputation has shifted from skilled veterinarian to eccentric one, the vet who talks about impossible animals and extra-dimensional biology. Most clients humor her, accept her treatment recommendations, don't question her stranger diagnoses. The animals she treats remain healthy, benefit from her care, exist in their approximations of familiar forms. But Hannah knows eventually she'll encounter an animal from a dimension too different, an anatomy so incompatible with terrestrial biology that her veterinary knowledge won't transfer, won't provide foundation for treatment. She'll fail to save an animal because its biology operates under principles she can't infer from Earth biology. And that failure might kill not just the animal but its owner, because the cognitive disconnect that allows owners to accept impossible pets might shatter if the pet dies, might force them to see what they've been unable to see. And the recognition that you've been caring for an extra-dimensional animal might break a person's ability to function in consensus reality. Hannah worries about that outcome, tries to prevent it by providing the best care she can across dimensional boundaries, by adapting her veterinary practice to accommodate biology that evolved in realities she'll never visit. by accepting the impossible animals with the same professional care she provides terrestrial species. She's the veterinarian who treats whatever walks through her clinic door, regardless of whether that animal should exist, regardless of whether its anatomy makes sense, regardless of whether its biology contradicts everything she learned in veterinary school. Because in the mountains of North Carolina, reality isn't singular, biology isn't fixed, and the animals people love and care for might be visitors from dimensions where evolution took different paths, where anatomy organized under different principles, where dogs have skeletons that flicker between states and cats exist in quantum superposition and horses have organs serving functions terrestrial biology doesn't require. And Dr. Hannah Reeves treats them all, provides care across dimensional boundaries, serves as the veterinarian for multiple overlapping realities that converge in Appalachia, where the mountains are old enough to remember when Earth's biology was radically different, and young enough to still be changing, still be permeable, still allow impossible animals to manifest in approximately familiar forms, and find veterinarians willing to look past the impossibility and treat them with the same compassion and skill applied to any patient, regardless of which dimension they call home or how many dimensions they occupy simultaneously, or whether their biology makes sense to anyone except Dr. Reeves, who's learned that impossibility is just unfamiliarity, that extra-dimensional anatomy is still anatomy, and a veterinarian's oath to care for animals doesn't specify which dimension those animals must come from. So she treats them all, the possible and impossible alike, the terrestrial and extra-dimensional, the pets that flicker and the livestock that shouldn't exist, providing veterinary medicine to the full spectrum of biological diversity that exists when you practice in a place where dimensional boundaries are suggestions rather than barriers. And animals from infinite variations of evolutionary history can cross into our reality and find care from the one veterinarian whose perception allows her to see what they truly are and whose dedication allows her to treat them anyway. Story 6. The Library with Books from Tomorrow. Audrey Mitchell worked as head librarian for the Morgan County Public Library in West Liberty, Kentucky, a position she'd held for 19 years. The library was modest, serving a county of approximately 13,000 residents, providing the standard services of public libraries: book lending, internet access, community programming, literacy assistance. Audrey managed a staff of 4, maintained a collection of approximately 40,000 volumes, and coordinated with the state library system for interlibrary loans and resource sharing. It was fulfilling work serving a community that valued reading despite limited resources. The future books started appearing in September 2020. Audrey was processing returned items when she found a book that didn't match their collection, a hardcover thriller by an author she didn't recognize titled The Convergence Point by Michael Torres. She scanned the barcode. Not in their system. She checked the copyright page. Published 2024 by a press she'd never heard of. Audrey assumed it was an interlibrary loan incorrectly returned to Morgan County. She set it aside to research later. 2 more future books appeared the next day, both with publication dates in 2023 and 2024. Then 5 more, then 12. Within a week, Audrey's returns cart contained 37 books from the future, all published between 2 and 4 years ahead of current date. All by authors she couldn't find in any current publisher catalog or database. Audrey examined the books carefully. They weren't hoaxes or mislabeled. The printing quality, paper stock, binding all matched current publishing standards. The ISBN numbers followed correct format but weren't registered in books in print databases. The books contained copyright information, author biographies, publisher addresses. Everything suggested these were legitimate publications from several years in the future. Audrey read one, The Thriller by Michael Torres. It was professionally written, well-edited, referenced current events from 2023 that hadn't happened yet. Characters used technology that didn't exist yet, described political situations that were plausible futures of current tensions but hadn't manifested. The book was clearly fiction, but the world it depicted was several years ahead of present time. More future books arrived daily, not returned by patrons but appearing on shelves or in the returns drop box overnight without any record of how they got there. Audrey started cataloging them separately, fiction and non-fiction from 2023, 2024, 2025. The non-fiction was particularly disturbing, history books describing events that hadn't occurred yet, a book about the 2024 presidential election, a biography of a celebrity who hadn't achieved fame yet, scientific texts describing discoveries announced in 2025. Audrey tried to use the books for prediction to verify whether they depicted actual future or fabricated fiction. She noted predictions from the non-fiction titles, waited to see if events unfolded as described. The correlations were imperfect but significant. A book describing natural disasters in 2023 accurately predicted 2 hurricanes and 1 earthquake, though missed several other disasters. A book about technology trends accurately predicted 3 major product releases but incorrectly predicted 2 others. The books were from a possible future, Audrey concluded, not necessarily the definite future. They described one timeline that might manifest, one version of events that could occur if current trends continued in specific directions. But the future was malleable, could branch, could shift based on decisions and randomness, so the book's predictions were probabilistic rather than certain. Audrey shared the books with patrons, adding them to normal circulation despite their impossible publication dates. Most patrons didn't notice or care about the dates, treated the books as normal recent releases. But a few noticed, asked Audrey how the library had obtained books from the future. Audrey had no explanation except that books appeared overnight, manifested from somewhere or somewhen, and she'd decided to lend them rather than hide them. The future book collection grew to over 300 volumes by December 2020. Audrey organized them by publication year, creating a section of the library dedicated to books from 2023 through 2027. Patrons could browse the future, read novels and non-fiction describing years they hadn't lived yet, gain knowledge and perspectives from a time that might or might not occur. But the books had an effect Audrey hadn't anticipated. Patrons who read them started making decisions based on future knowledge. A farmer read an agriculture text from 2025, learned about a drought that would devastate crops and changed his planting strategy. A high school student read a college guide from 2024, learned which universities would have new programs and adjusted her application strategy accordingly. People were using the future books to prepare for events that hadn't happened yet, events that might not happen if people prepared for them. Audrey realized she was creating temporal paradoxes. If people read about the future and changed their behavior to avoid negative outcomes or achieve positive ones, they were altering the timeline that produced the books, potentially preventing the future the books described. The books might be self-negating, prophecies, predictions that became false because people acted on them. She tried to track the effect by comparing book predictions to actual events as time progressed. The drought described in the 2025 agriculture text didn't occur in 2025, possibly because farmers had read the book and prepared, altering the conditions that would have caused the drought. The college program described in the 2024 guide didn't materialize, possibly because the student who would have pioneered it changed her plans after reading about it. The future the books described was diverging from the future that manifested, creating a branching timeline. The books came from one possible future, but by reading them, people created a different future, one where the book's predictions didn't occur. Audrey was operating a library that destroyed its own collection, not physically but causally, making the books false by distributing them. New books continued appearing, but their publication dates started shifting. Instead of 2023 through 2027, new arrivals were dated 2026 through 2030, pushing further into the future as the near-term timeline diverged from the book's predictions. Audrey theorized the books came from a fixed point, a specific version of the future that was becoming less probable as people acted on knowledge from that future. And as that future became unlikely, only books from further ahead could still appear, books describing times too distant for current actions to significantly affect. By 2022, the library's future book collection contained volumes dated as far ahead as 2035, but nothing between 2023 and 2025. The near-term future had been disrupted too much, had diverged from the timeline the books described, so only distant future books could still manifest, books describing times when current disruptions would have played out, and the timeline stabilized into a new configuration. Audrey stopped adding future books to public circulation. She stored them in a restricted collection, accessible only by request, accompanied by warnings that reading them might alter the futures they described. Most patrons lost interest once the books stopped describing near-term future, stopped being immediately useful for planning their lives. Reading about 2035 from 2022 was too abstract, too distant to affect current decisions. But Audrey continued reading them. She was experiencing her own future through the books, reading about a version of herself who lived through the years ahead, who aged and worked and eventually retired, who experienced joys and sorrows and mundane days in years she hadn't reached yet. The books depicted her death, occasionally peripheral mentions in local news sections or obituaries. She died in 2041 in one book, 2038 in another, 2044 in a third. The variation suggested multiple possible futures, still multiple timelines branching from her present. Audrey realized everyone has these multiple futures, these branching timelines where different decisions lead to different outcomes and different death dates. Most people don't see their futures because the books describing them don't manifest in libraries. But Audrey's library was receiving them, was accumulating a collection of possible tomorrows. And she was the librarian responsible for organizing and preserving futures that might never occur. She still works at Morgan County Public Library, managing the normal collection and the future collection simultaneously. The future books continue appearing, though less frequently, only the most distant dates now. Books from the 2040s and 2050s describing a world so changed from present that current actions can barely affect it. Audrey catalogs them carefully, maintains the restricted collection, occasionally shows them to researchers interested in how people imagine the future, though she doesn't correct their assumption that the books are fiction rather than documentation from timelines that might manifest. She knows eventually she'll receive a book dated after her last possible death year, a book from a future she won't live to see regardless of which timeline manifests. That will be confirmation that she's reached the limit of her branching, that beyond a certain point all her timelines converge in death, that the only futures ahead are ones without her. She both dreads and anticipates that book's arrival, the final publication that will tell her she's run out of alternative tomorrows, that the only uncertainty remaining is which specific path leads to the same inevitable destination. Until then, Audrey curates the future, organizes books from times that haven't happened, provides access to knowledge from years that might never manifest, serves as librarian for the Morgan County Public Library's collection of approximately 40,000 present-day volumes and 317 future volumes spanning publication dates through 2053. The last book to arrive, titled Appalachian Elegy, Last Songs of the Mountains, a collection of essays about the final years of inhabitable climate in eastern Kentucky. dated 2053, describing a world Audrey will never live to see but can read about, can prepare for in small ways, can mourn preemptively by shelving it carefully in the restricted collection where books from tomorrow wait for readers brave enough to learn what might come. What probably won't come because learning about it changes it. What certainly won't come exactly as described because futures are malleable and books are interventions, not predictions. And Audrey Mitchell, who reads them all, understands she's living in a library where every book is partially fiction because publishing it makes it less likely to manifest, where every future described becomes improbable through description, where her job isn't preserving the future but preventing it, one book at a time, one reader at a time, one decision influenced by future knowledge at a time, until the timeline diverges so completely from the book's origins that they become pure fiction, artifacts from a future that won't occur, shelved alongside the fantasy and science fiction where they'll eventually belong once everyone has forgotten they arrived from tomorrow rather than being imagined today. Story 7. The mechanic who repaired yesterday's cars. Luis Vargas owned an auto repair shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, operating out of a 3-bay garage on the edge of town. He'd been a mechanic for 34 years, learned the trade from his father, worked at dealerships before opening his own shop in 2005. Luis specialized in older vehicles, the trucks and cars that rural Kentuckians drove for decades because buying new wasn't economically viable. His expertise was keeping vehicles running long past their design life, fabricating parts when originals weren't available, solving problems through mechanical ingenuity rather than computer diagnostics. The temporal displacement started in August 2021. A customer brought in a 1987 Chevrolet pickup with transmission problems. Luis put the truck on the lift, examined the transmission, and found it was working perfectly. He tested it thoroughly, couldn't replicate the shifting problems the customer described. He called the customer, explained the transmission was fine. The customer insisted the truck had been shifting rough just yesterday, had barely made it to the shop. Luis returned the truck to the customer without charge, puzzled but not alarmed. But the next day, the same customer returned with the same truck, same complaint. Luis examined it again. This time the transmission was damaged exactly as the customer had described, gears worn, synchronizers failing. Luis repaired it, standard rebuild, returned the truck. The customer left satisfied. 3 days later, Luis was organizing his service records and noticed something impossible. The dates were wrong. The first visit from the customer with the '87 Chevy was dated August 19th. The second visit was dated August 18th. The customer had brought the truck in with the problem the day before Luis had examined it and found nothing wrong. The visits were reversed in time, effect before cause. Luis checked his shop's video surveillance. The footage confirmed the impossible chronology. The customer's truck appeared in the video from August 18th with visible transmission damage, the same damage Luis had repaired. But in the video from August 19th, the truck showed no damage, was in the working condition Luis had found when he first examined it. The repair preceded the problem. Luis had fixed the transmission the day before it broke. More temporal displacements followed. Vehicles would arrive for repair. Luis would examine them and find nothing wrong. Then the same vehicles would arrive days earlier with the problems their owners described. Luis was experiencing his work backwards, examining vehicles after he'd repaired them, then repairing them before they broke. Time in his shop was running in reverse, or alternatively running in both directions simultaneously. Luis tested the phenomenon carefully. When a vehicle arrived with a problem he couldn't find, he'd make note of exactly what the owner described, then wait. Within a week, usually the same vehicle would appear with the described problem but dated several days before the initial visit. Luis would repair it, and the repair would manifest in the later examination where he'd originally found nothing wrong. His shop was operating in a temporal loop, servicing vehicles before and after their problems simultaneously. Luis was becoming his own memory, repairing cars based on knowledge from examinations that would occur in his subjective future but calendar past. He'd know what was wrong before he diagnosed it because he'd already seen the vehicle in its repaired state. The effect intensified. Luis started receiving vehicles that hadn't broken yet, trucks and cars arriving for repairs of problems that wouldn't manifest for weeks. Owners would bring vehicles running perfectly, insist they needed work, and Luis would find nothing wrong. But he'd learned to trust the pattern. He'd perform the repairs anyway, based on problems he'd see later when the same vehicles returned dated earlier. And his preemptive repairs would prevent breakdowns, would fix issues before they manifested. Luis's reputation grew. Customers marveled at his diagnostic ability, his seemingly psychic knowledge of what was wrong with their vehicles. They'd bring perfectly running cars. Luis would replace parts that seemed fine, and weeks later those parts would fail in exactly the way Luis had predicted and prevented. He was maintaining vehicles before they broke, keeping them running through preemptive maintenance guided by knowledge from his own reversed timeline. But Luis was aging wrong. His body experienced time in both directions simultaneously, living forward through calendar dates while working backward through his repairs. He'd wake up sore from work he wouldn't do until tomorrow, would feel rested from sleep he wouldn't get until yesterday. His memories were confused, couldn't sort whether events had happened yet or were about to happen or had happened in his subjective past but calendar future. His wife noticed the changes. Luis would reference conversations they hadn't had yet, would remember events that hadn't occurred. He was living through days in nonlinear order, experiencing tomorrow's arguments before today's discussions, knowing the outcomes of decisions before making them. His life was becoming as temporally displaced as his shop, existing in a loop where cause and effect had lost clear sequence. Luis tried to close the shop to escape the temporal displacement, but vehicles kept arriving, manifesting in his bays overnight without owners, damaged, in ways he'd repair tomorrow or had repaired yesterday. The shop existed in its own temporal bubble, and Luis was trapped inside it, continuing his work regardless of whether he officially operated the business. He found he couldn't leave, literally couldn't walk away from the shop. He'd try to drive home, but his truck would circle back, arriving at the shop regardless of his intended direction. He'd try walking, but every path led back to his bays, his lifts, his tools. The temporal loop had geographic extent, had anchored Luis to the location where time ran backwards and forwards simultaneously. Luis adapted. If he couldn't leave, he'd continue working, continue repairing vehicles from both directions of time. He lived in his shop, sleeping in the office, eating from convenience stores that delivered, working constantly on cars that arrived from past and future simultaneously. He repaired vehicles before they broke and after they broke and during their breaking, existing at all points in their service timelines simultaneously. His family tried to intervene, but they couldn't reach him. When they visited the shop, they'd find different versions of Luis working in different bays, all engaged in different stages of the same repairs. Multiple Luis Vargases existing simultaneously in his temporally displaced garage. They'd call out, and none of the Luises would respond, too focused on their work or unable to hear from their different temporal positions. Luis exists there still, working in his shop in Whitesburg, repairing vehicles from multiple timelines simultaneously. If you bring your car to his garage, you might find him repairing it before you explain the problem, might find it already fixed because he'll fix it yesterday, might find multiple versions of Luis working on different aspects of the same repair in parallel timelines that converge in his 3-bay garage where time lost coherence in August 2021 and never recovered. The locals know about Luis's shop, know that time works differently there. Know you can bring your car and Luis will fix it before it breaks if you're willing to experience the transaction non-linearly. Willing to pay for repairs before they happen or after they're completed, depending on which temporal direction you approach from. Most people avoid the shop, disturbed by the temporal displacement, uncomfortable with a mechanic who exists in loops and simultaneities. But some customers continue visiting, bringing vehicles to the mechanic who repairs yesterday's problems, who knows what's wrong before diagnosing it, who exists in every moment of his shop's operation simultaneously. The mechanic who tried to run a normal repair business and accidentally discovered that his shop sat on a location where time branched, where past and future existed simultaneously, where cause and effect reversed. And Luis Vargas, who thought he understood sequential repair procedures, learned that some vehicles need service from both temporal directions, need repairs applied before and after their problems, need a mechanic willing to exist in nonlinear time, experiencing his work backwards and forwards, living through the same days repeatedly from different perspectives, aging in both directions simultaneously, becoming younger and older, repairing and breaking, fixing and damaging, existing in superposition between mechanic and memory, between cause and effect, between the person who broke the timeline by working in a location where time was already broken and discovered too late that some repairs can't be completed because they exist in loops, can't be finished because they precede themselves, can't be resolved because the mechanic who starts them is also the mechanic who already completed them. And Luis Vargas is both, is all the versions of himself working in all the temporal layers of his shop simultaneously. The mechanic who repairs yesterday's cars and tomorrow's cars and today's cars all at once, who exists in every moment of August 2021 forward and backward, who will die eventually in one timeline and already died in another and hasn't died yet in a third. And all three Luises, living, dying, dead, continue working in the shop where time forgot how to flow in one direction and created a mechanic who exists in all directions simultaneously, repairing the vehicles that arrive from past and future, keeping cars running across timelines, serving customers who bring problems from yesterday and tomorrow and receive solutions from whenever Luis happens to be working, which is always, which is never, which is both and neither, because time in his shop isn't linear and Luis isn't singular, and the repairs he performs exist in probability space where fixed and broken are superposition states until observed, and observation changes the outcome, and Luis Vargas became quantum, became wave function, became the mechanic who exists in every possible state of his shop simultaneously, and you can still visit him, can still bring your car, can still receive service from the man who learned that some locations refuse to participate in linear time, and take their occupants with them into temporal displacement where yesterday and tomorrow are equally present, and repairs applied in the future fix problems from the past, and the mechanic who performs them exists in loops eating his own timeline, becoming memory of himself, becoming the shop, becoming time itself as it breaks and circles and never resolves because resolution requires endpoints. And Luis's timeline is a loop that has no end and no beginning. Just continuous existence in the garage where cause and effect divorced and created a mechanic who serves both in their separation, keeping vehicles running across the temporal divide, one repair at a time, in both directions simultaneously, forever. Story 8. The grocery store that stocked extinctions. Patricia Holmes managed a small grocery store in rural West Virginia, a family-owned business serving a community of approximately 200 residents in the hills outside Spencer. The store had been operating since 1968, occupying a renovated house on Route 14, providing basic groceries and supplies to people who didn't want to drive 40 minutes to the nearest Walmart. Patricia had taken over management from her father in 2014, maintaining the store's traditions. Personal service, credit accounts for neighbors, stocking items specifically requested by regular customers. The extinct products started appearing in November 2021. Patricia was restocking shelves when she found a box of breakfast cereal she didn't recognize. Crispy Wheats, manufactured by a company called American Breakfast Foods with packaging design from the 1970s. She checked her inventory system. She hadn't ordered this product. She checked supplier manifests. No deliveries matched, but the box sat on her shelf sealed and fresh with an expiration date of March 1979. Patricia opened the box. The cereal inside looked and smelled normal, wheat flakes with a sugar coating. She tasted one. Normal flavor, slightly stale as cereal from 1979 would be, but not spoiled. The box had somehow maintained its contents for 42 years, arriving in her store in 2021 with 1979 expiration date, impossibly preserved. More extinct products appeared. Patricia would find them mixed in with normal inventory. Soft drinks from brands that had discontinued in the 1980s, candy bars from companies that went bankrupt in the 1990s, cleaning products made with chemicals banned in the 2000s. All were fresh or reasonably preserved. All had expiration dates from decades past. All were products that shouldn't exist anymore because they'd been replaced by newer formulations, or eliminated by changing regulations, or abandoned when their manufacturers closed. Patricia started separating the extinct products, creating a special section in her store. She priced them as curiosities, charged premium for nostalgia value. Customers were initially delighted, purchasing products they remembered from childhoods, brands they'd forgotten existed. An elderly woman bought Tab Cola from 1985, cried while drinking it, said it tasted exactly like she remembered. A man purchased Chuckles candy from 1976, shared them with his grandchildren, explained these were the sweets his mother bought him. But the extinct products weren't limited to discontinued brands. Patricia started finding items that were more fundamentally extinct, foods from species that no longer existed. A can of passenger pigeon soup, dated 1910, from a bird that went extinct in 1914. A jar of Tasmanian tiger meat, dated 1932, from an animal that went extinct in 1936. A package of Caribbean monk seal jerky, dated 1948, from a species declared extinct in 2008. Patricia researched these items, confirmed they were legitimate. The passenger pigeon soup's ingredients matched historical recipes. The Tasmanian tiger meat's protein structure matched preserved genetic samples. The Caribbean monk seal jerky contained DNA from the extinct species. These weren't hoaxes or mislabeled products. These were authentic foods from extinct animals, preserved for decades or over a century, manifesting in her grocery store in 2021. The pattern extended beyond animals. Patricia found produce from extinct plant varieties, heirloom vegetables that hadn't been grown since the early 1900s when industrial agriculture standardized crop varieties. She found flour milled from wheat strains that didn't exist anymore, rice from varieties lost when monoculture replaced diversity, fruits from tree varieties cut down and never replanted. Her store was becoming a repository of extinctions, a grocery store stocking the biological diversity that humanity had eliminated through hunting, habitat destruction, agricultural standardization, and industrial development. Every shelf contained ghosts of species and varieties that had existed but didn't anymore. Their physical remains preserved in canned goods and packaged foods, arriving in Patricia's store through processes she couldn't identify. Patricia tried to source the extinct products to understand where they were coming from. She checked her store's receiving area, installed security cameras, monitored deliveries. The extinct items never arrived through normal channels. They manifested directly on shelves, appearing overnight when the store was closed and empty, adding themselves to inventory without human intervention. She experimented by selling the extinct products. Customers purchased them, consumed them, experienced flavors and textures from species they'd never encountered, from animals and plants that had vanished before most customers were born. The foods were safe, caused no illnesses, provided normal nutrition. But eating them felt transgressive, like consuming history, like participating in the extinctions by benefiting from the eliminated species even decades or centuries after their disappearance. The extinct products affected Patricia psychologically. She'd stock shelves with foods from vanished animals, price them, sell them to customers, and feel complicit in the extinctions her store was commemorating. Every can of passenger pigeon soup sold was a reminder that humans had hunted those birds to extinction, that the soup in the can represented one of millions of birds killed until none remained. Every jar of Tasmanian tiger meat represented a predator eliminated because settlers considered it a threat to livestock, shot them systematically until the species vanished. Patricia started refusing to sell the extinct products. She removed them from shelves, stored them in a back room, tried to preserve them as archives rather than merchandise. But customers demanded access. They wanted to taste extinction, wanted to experience what had been lost, were willing to pay extraordinary prices for foods from vanished species. Patricia realized her store had become a market for extinction, a place where humanity's biological destruction was literally being consumed, where the physical remains of eliminated species were being distributed and eaten, where extinction was being converted from historical tragedy into commodity. And she was the manager, the facilitator, the person deciding who could purchase these extinctions and for how much. She tried to use the extinct products educationally to help customers understand what had been lost. She created information cards for each item explaining the species' history, how it went extinct, what ecological role it had filled. She hoped that understanding the extinctions would discourage consumption, would make customers see the products as warnings rather than novelties. But education had the opposite effect. Customers became more interested, more willing to pay, more eager to consume. Knowing a species was extinct made eating it more valuable, more exclusive, more desirable. Patricia was creating a perverse market where rarity increased demand rather than discouraging consumption. She stopped opening the store, closed indefinitely, she told inquiring customers, family emergency. But the extinct products continued appearing inside, filling the shelves whether Patricia sold them or not. The store was becoming a museum or a mausoleum, a repository for species that existed only in preserved form, their physical remains accumulated in cans and jars and packages dated from across the 20th century. Patricia visits the store weekly now, documents the new extinctions that have appeared, catalogs them in a database she's building, a comprehensive list of every vanished species whose physical remains are manifesting in her small grocery store on Route 14. She's identified over 300 extinct species so far, from passenger pigeons to Caribbean monk seals to plant varieties eliminated when industrial agriculture standardized crops to maximize yields and minimize diversity. She doesn't sell the products anymore. She doesn't even open the store to customers. But she maintains it, preserves it, keeps the building secure so the extinct products remain protected. She's become curator of extinctions, guardian of biological ghosts, the manager of a grocery store that stocks what's been lost, that receives shipments from the past when species still existed, that serves as physical archive of humanity's systematic elimination of biological diversity across the centuries of industrial expansion and agricultural standardization. Patricia knows eventually the store will run out of space. Eventually, every species humanity has eliminated will be represented on the shelves in canned or packaged form. and the store will be full, a complete record of anthropogenic extinction. She wonders what happens then, whether the store will stop receiving extinct products or whether it will start stocking species that haven't gone extinct yet but will. Products from the future when currently existing species are eliminated. She fears the store is showing her the future as much as the past, that the extinct products are warnings about what's coming, that eventually the shelves will contain foods from animals and plants that currently exist but won't survive the next decades of climate change and habitat destruction. She fears she'll see packages of foods from species she currently shares the world with dated years ahead, confirming their future extinctions. Patricia Holmes sits in her closed grocery store surrounded by 300 extinctions, reading labels, learning histories, mourning species. She never encountered a live but can hold in her hands in preserved form the grocery store manager who became documentarian of biological tragedy, who maintains a comprehensive archive of what humans have eliminated, who guards the physical remains of vanished diversity against a world that seems eager to consume even extinctions, to purchase and eat and eliminate from memory the species we've already eliminated from existence, as if eating them a second time in preserved form will somehow complete the erasure we started with guns and habitat destruction and industrial agriculture. The store remains closed but full, shelves stocked with extinctions, aisles lined with biological ghosts, a grocery store that serves no customers but receives constant shipments from the past when species still existed, when diversity was richer, when the world contained creatures and plants that don't exist anymore except in cans and jars and packages dated decades or centuries ago, preserved perfectly, manifesting in a small store in rural West Virginia where Patricia Holmes guards them against consumption, against forgetting, against the second death that comes when we forget what we've eliminated and why that elimination matters and what we lost when we decided certain species were inconvenient or unprofitable or incompatible with the world we were building. And the grocery store on Route 14 remains the physical monument to those decisions, the archive of extinctions, the place where biological diversity goes to be stored and remembered and mourned by the one woman willing to maintain the record even when everyone else wants to forget or worse, wants to consume, wants to eat extinction as novelty, wants to taste what's been lost without accepting responsibility for the loss. And Patricia won't allow it, won't sell it, won't participate in the consumption of what should be preserved as warning and memorial and proof that 300 species we shared the world with are gone and more are going, and eventually the store will stock them all. Every extinction past and future, every species eliminated by human action, every biological dead end we created through our systematic destruction of the diversity that existed before we decided the world should be simplified, standardized, optimized for our benefit regardless of cost to everyone else we shared it with. And the grocery store collects the cost, displays it on shelves, preserves it in the darkness of a closed store where extinctions accumulate and Patricia Holmes maintains vigil. The manager who became guardian, the woman who stocks what shouldn't be sold, who preserves what can't be replaced, who guards against the final forgetting that comes when even the preserved remains of extinct species are consumed and eliminated, leaving nothing behind but labels and dates and the knowledge that 300 species once existed and now exist only in a closed grocery store in West Virginia, where time sends back samples of what it's taken and asks implicitly whether we notice, whether we care, whether we'll change before the store runs out of shelf space and starts stocking species we still have time to save if we choose saving over consuming, preserving over profiting, remembering over forgetting. Story 9. The toll booth that charged in years. David Kim worked as a toll collector for the West Virginia Turnpike, stationed at the Beckley exit collecting fees from drivers traveling through southern West Virginia. He'd held the position for 7 years, an increasingly obsolete job as electronic toll collection replaced human operators, but his particular toll booth remained manually operated, serving drivers who didn't have Easy Pass transponders or whose transponders malfunctioned. David worked overnight shift, midnight to 8 a.m., processing maybe 40 or 50 transactions per shift. Mostly long-haul truckers and travelers too tired to notice they were being charged for road use. The temporal charges started in October 2022. David was processing a standard transaction, a sedan passing through around 2 a.m. when his terminal displayed an error he'd never seen. Insufficient temporal balance, payment declined. David assumed it was a system glitch, tried processing the card again. Same error. He asked the driver for alternative payment. The driver offered cash. David accepted it, processed the transaction manually, let the driver through. But the error recurred throughout the night. Multiple vehicles triggered the same message. Insufficient temporal balance. David reported it to his supervisor, who checked the system remotely, found no problems with David's terminal or the central processing system. The supervisor suggested David was misreading error messages, possibly confusing them with standard insufficient funds alerts. But David knew what he'd seen. The word temporal was specific, wasn't part of normal error messages. He started documenting every occurrence, taking photos of his terminal when the error appeared. Over the next week, the temporal balance errors increased in frequency. By the end of October, approximately 30% of David's transactions triggered the message. David started asking drivers about their temporal balance when the error occurred. Most were confused, had no idea what he meant. But one driver, an elderly woman passing through around 3 a.m., understood immediately. She said her temporal balance was low, that she'd used up most of her remaining time, that she didn't have years to spare for toll fees. David asked what she meant. The woman explained that the toll wasn't charging money for road use. It was charging time, lifetime, years of existence. Every vehicle that passed through was paying with minutes or hours or days of their remaining life. David thought she was delirious or confused, but he checked his terminal more carefully. In addition to the dollar amount displayed for each toll, there was a second number barely visible printed in gray text. Time charges ranging from 0.03 days to 0.127 days. Every vehicle was being charged both money and time, and the time was being deducted from somewhere, subtracted from someone's balance. David researched the turnpike's history. The road had been built in the 1950s, a modern highway cutting through West Virginia's mountains, connecting Charleston to Princeton through terrain that had been difficult to navigate. The construction had been expensive, funded through bonds that would be repaid by toll revenue, but the original financing documents included unusual language, provisions about temporal depreciation and life cost assessments, terminology that didn't match standard transportation finance. David theorized that the turnpike's construction had created a debt measured not just in dollars but in time. A debt charged against the collective lifespan of everyone who used the road. Every driver paid with money and with minutes of their life, and that lifetime accumulated somewhere, serviced the temporal debt created when the turnpike was carved through mountains in violation of some principle David didn't understand. Some natural law that said roads shouldn't run through certain places or should be paid for with more than money. The temporal charges increased. By November, David's terminal was displaying time costs openly, no longer hiding them in gray text. Drivers could see they were being charged minutes or hours for passing through. Most still didn't understand, assumed the time displays were countdown timers or processing indicators. But some understood, the elderly, mostly people close enough to death to sense when time was being taken from them. An old man stopped at David's booth, refused to pay. He said he didn't have time to spare, had maybe months remaining, couldn't afford to lose hours to toll fees. David sympathized but explained the fee was mandatory. The gate wouldn't open without payment. The old man sat in his vehicle, blocking the toll booth, refusing to pay or retreat. Eventually, police arrived, removed the old man, charged him with obstruction. But the incident haunted David. He'd participated in extracting time from a man who had little time remaining, had enforced a system that charged life for passage through mountains. David tried to quit. He submitted resignation, gave 2 weeks' notice. But when his final day came, he found himself unable to leave the toll booth, literally unable. He'd try to walk away, but his legs wouldn't cooperate, would carry him back to his station. He was bound to the booth somehow, obligated to continue collecting tolls, required to extract both money and time from every driver passing through. He realized all toll collectors were bound this way, that accepting the position created an obligation that couldn't be resigned, that toll collectors served until their own temporal balance ran out, until the time they'd collected from others was sufficient to release them. David checked the employment records of previous toll collectors at his booth. All had died while employed. No resignations or retirements, just death certificates and replacement hiring. The position wasn't a job, it was a sentence, a commitment to collect time from others until you'd collected enough to pay your own debt. David tried to warn other toll collectors, to explain the temporal charges and the binding obligation. Most dismissed him, thought he was experiencing stress or mental breakdown. But a few acknowledged they'd noticed the time charges, had tried to quit and found themselves unable, were serving sentences they hadn't understood when they accepted employment. David learned to minimize the time he collected. He'd process transactions as quickly as possible, reducing the time charges by improving efficiency. He'd let some vehicles through without full payment, absorbing the shortfall himself, paying with his own time to spare drivers. He couldn't refuse to charge, couldn't avoid the extraction entirely, but he could reduce it, could minimize the time taken from each driver. But his interventions had consequences. By absorbing charges himself, David was depleting his own temporal balance faster than normal collection would. He was aging rapidly, visibly, losing years and months. His co-workers noticed, suggested he take time off, see a doctor. David couldn't take time off. The binding required him to staff his booth, to collect tolls continuously until his balance reached zero. David aged from 42 to apparent 70 in the span of 6 months. His health deteriorated, his body consuming itself to pay the temporal debts he'd absorbed from drivers. He continued working, continued minimizing charges, continued sacrificing his remaining time to spare others, knowing he was accelerating his own death but unable to stop, unable to participate in the system without trying to mitigate its harm. David Kim died at his toll booth in April 2023, aged 43 by calendar but 97 by biological markers. He collapsed. During his shift, heart failure from accelerated aging, body exhausted by temporal depletion. The Turnpike Authority listed his death as natural causes, hired a replacement toll collector without explaining the position's true nature, continued collecting tolls in dollars and days and minutes and years from drivers who mostly don't notice they're paying with life for the privilege of passage through mountains that remember when roads weren't here, and charge toll for the violation of cutting asphalt through ancient stone. David's replacement is learning slowly what the position requires, is beginning to notice the temporal charges, is starting to understand the binding obligation. The replacement will serve until death, like David served, like all toll collectors serve on the West Virginia Turnpike, where passage costs more than money costs, time costs, years extracted minute by minute from everyone who drives through, paying tolls they think are measured in dollars but are actually measured in the only currency that matters, the only resource we can't renew or extend or borrow, the time we have from birth to death, finite and diminishing. And the Turnpike takes its share, collects its toll, extracts payment for the road through mountains that didn't want roads, through stone that resents the passage, through geology old enough to remember when time was measured in millennia and species, not minutes and individuals. And the turnpike balances that resentment by collecting from the individuals who use it, by charging them in the currency of their limited existence, by extracting days and hours and minutes and seconds until their balances reach zero, and another driver's life is paid in full to the road that wasn't supposed to exist, that violated something by existing, that charges temporal toll to balance the equation between what was taken when construction carved through the mountains and what must be returned by everyone who benefits from that carving, and David Kim, who tried to minimize that extraction, who absorbed charges to spare others, who paid with his years to reduce the collective cost, died serving a road that charges what we can't afford to give but must give anyway because passage requires payment. And the West Virginia Turnpike accepts only time, only life. Only the years will never get back, deducted toll by the collectors who stand in their booths like David stood, like the replacement stands, bound to positions they can't resign, extracting time they don't want to take, serving the road until their own time runs out and the next collector is hired and bound and deployed to collect tolls in years from drivers who pay thinking the charges are measured in dollars, who pass through thinking they've lost only money, who age slightly faster not knowing why, who die slightly sooner not understanding the cost, who travel the West Virginia Turnpike unaware that every mile costs minutes, every passage costs hours, and the toll is collected whether you pay in cash or card or Easy Pass or life, because life is what the road demands. Life is what balances the ledger. Life is what repairs the violation of cutting modern highway through Appalachian stone that's older than the country and less forgiving than any collector standing in the booth taking payment for passage through mountains that never forget and never forgive and charge forever in the only currency that matters. Story 10. The weather vane that pointed to deaths. Margaret Finley inherited her grandmother's farmhouse outside Elkins, West Virginia, a property that had been in her family since the 1880s. Margaret had grown up visiting the farm, spent summers there as a child, remembered it fondly despite its isolation and aging infrastructure. When her grandmother died in September 2019, Margaret was the only heir willing to take the property, willing to maintain it, and eventually retire there. The farmhouse sat on 40 acres of mountain land, most of it forested, with a small cleared area around the house and barn. The weather vane sat atop the barn's cupola, a wrought iron rooster that had been installed when the barn was built in 1892. Margaret's grandmother had mentioned the weather vane occasionally, said it was accurate, better than any weather forecast. Margaret assumed she meant it was sensitive to wind direction changes that preceded weather systems. But after moving to the property in October 2019, Margaret learned the weather vane's true function. The rooster didn't point to wind direction, it pointed to deaths. Wherever the weather vane aimed, someone in that direction would die within 24 hours. Margaret discovered this pattern gradually, noticing that when the rooster pointed toward town, someone in Elkins would die. When it pointed toward her neighbor's property, her neighbor's elderly mother died. When it pointed southeast toward her cousin's house, her cousin's husband died in a vehicle accident. Margaret documented the pattern for 3 months, tracking the weather vane's orientation and cross-referencing obituaries. The correlation was perfect. Every time the weather vane shifted direction significantly, a death occurred in that direction within a day. The distance varied, sometimes pointing to nearby properties, sometimes to locations 20 or 30 miles away. But the direction was always accurate, always indicated the precise bearing from Margaret's barn to the location where someone would die. Margaret tried to use the weather vane to prevent deaths. When it pointed toward a specific direction, she'd drive that direction, look for people in distress, try to warn them or provide help. But she couldn't determine distance. couldn't know whether the death would occur a mile away or 20 miles away in the indicated direction. She'd find a person, warn them vaguely about being careful, and they'd dismiss her as strange. Or she wouldn't find anyone, and later would learn someone had died in that direction. Someone she'd passed or missed or couldn't have reached in time. The weather vane's predictions were inevitable, Margaret learned. Knowing about them didn't allow prevention. The deaths occurred despite warnings, despite interventions, despite Margaret's best efforts to disrupt the pattern. She theorized the weather vane wasn't predicting deaths, but was somehow connected to them, was responding to deaths that were already determined, locked into causality, inevitable regardless of action. Margaret researched the weather vane's history. She found her family's journals from the 1890s, entries describing its installation. Her great-great-grandfather had commissioned the weather vane from a blacksmith in Elkins, a man named Jakob Steiner, who'd immigrated from Germany in the 1880s. Steiner had a reputation for crafting iron objects with unusual properties, tools that stayed sharp indefinitely, hinges that never rusted, weather vanes that predicted more than weather. Margaret found references to Steiner in local historical records. He'd been tolerated but never fully accepted by the community, considered strange, possibly involved in folk magic or traditions from the old country that didn't translate well to Appalachia. He died in 1903. His workshop burned down under suspicious circumstances, and most of his works had been destroyed or hidden by customers who didn't want association with whatever practices he'd employed. But some of Steiner's works survived, scattered across Randolph County in barns and houses whose owners didn't know or didn't acknowledge their unusual properties. Margaret started searching for other Steiner pieces, talking to elderly residents, looking for iron objects that behaved strangely. She found a dozen items: a weather vane that pointed to fires before they started, a door handle that wouldn't open for people with violent intent, a bell that rang when lies were spoken near it. All exhibited impossible properties. All responded to information or events they shouldn't have access to. Margaret theorized Steiner had discovered or created a method of encoding intent or awareness into iron, creating objects that could perceive specific categories of events and respond accordingly. The weather vane wasn't predicting deaths. It was perceiving them, sensing when someone in range was approaching death, orienting toward that person like a compass needle toward magnetic north. Margaret tried to destroy the weather vane. She climbed to the barn's cupola, attempted to remove it, but the iron was stronger than it should be, resisted her tools, couldn't be broken or detached. She tried covering it, preventing it from rotating, but the rooster would shift orientation regardless of physical barriers, passing through cloth or wood like they weren't there, continuing to point toward deaths that were about to occur. Margaret stopped trying to prevent deaths, stopped driving toward the directions the weather vane indicated. She'd learned that knowing about upcoming deaths without being able to prevent them was torture, that witnessing the inevitability of death in 24-hour cycles was destroying her mental health. She tried to ignore the weather vane, to avoid looking at it, to pretend it didn't exist. But she couldn't ignore it completely. The weather vane started pointing toward directions closer to home, toward her house, toward her. Margaret realized eventually the weather vane would point directly at her location, indicating her own death within 24 hours. She'd receive one day's warning of her own mortality, one day to prepare or panic or accept or deny, one day between the weather vane's indication and her death's manifestation. Margaret became obsessed with the weather vane's orientation. She'd check it constantly, multiple times per hour, making sure it wasn't pointing toward her. She slept poorly, worried she'd miss the warning, would wake up on the day of her death without preparation. She developed elaborate plans for her final day, things she'd do or say or write if the weather vane pointed toward her location. The weather vane did point toward her house eventually in March 2021. Margaret woke at dawn, checked the barn, and found the rooster aimed directly at her farmhouse. She had 24 hours to live, according to the pattern. Margaret spent the day as she'd planned, calling family and friends, writing letters, organizing her affairs. She was calm, prepared, accepting of the inevitable. But she didn't die. 24 hours passed, then 36, then 48. The weather vane remained pointed at her house, but Margaret continued living. She'd broken the pattern somehow, had violated the weather vane's prediction. She felt triumphant, felt like she'd beaten death through preparation and acceptance. But the weather vane didn't shift. It remained aimed at Margaret's house through April, through May, through the rest of 2021. Margaret realized with growing horror that the weather vane was still indicating a death in her direction, that the death hadn't occurred yet despite the prediction, that she was living in an extended countdown, existing in the space between prediction and manifestation, unable to die but unable to escape the indication that she would die, trapped in the 24-hour window that had somehow stretched into months. Margaret lives there still, aging normally, healthy by all medical measures, but watched constantly by the weather vane that points toward her house, and has pointed toward her house for over 2 years now, indicating a death that should have occurred but hasn't, a death that's overdue but inevitable, a death that Margaret is living through slowly, dying in increments too small to measure, existing in superposition between living and dead because the weather vane pointed toward her and marked her for death. But something in her preparation or acceptance or awareness interrupted the process, froze her in the moment between prediction and fulfillment. She tends her grandmother's farmhouse, maintains the property, goes through motions of living while the weather vane points at her continuously, never shifting, never indicating another death because it's still indicating hers, still waiting for the event it predicted to manifest, still oriented toward Margaret Finley, who tried to use advanced warning to prepare for death and discovered that preparation interrupted death, suspended it, created a state where she's marked for death but can't die, where the weather vane's prediction is accurate but incomplete, where the 24 hours between indication and manifestation has stretched into years and might stretch into decades, and Margaret ages normally but knows she's dying, has been dying since March 2021 when the weather vane pointed toward her, continues dying in a process that has no defined endpoint, no moment when living transitions to dead, just gradual continuation of the dying state the weather vane indicated, and she maintains her farmhouse and walks her 40 acres and checks the weather vane daily, confirming it still points toward her, still marks her for death. And she's become the living proof that death isn't an event but a process, isn't a moment but a duration, and the weather vane that pointed to her death was accurate, is accurate, will remain accurate as long as Margaret lives in the dying state it predicted, as long as she exists in the space between the pointing and the fulfillment, between the indication and the event, between living and dead, where Margaret Finley has resided since the morning she checked the barn and found the iron rooster aimed directly at her house, announcing the death that hasn't come but is always coming, that she's experiencing slowly across years instead of quickly across hours, that the weather vane predicted and marked and froze her in by pointing toward her location and never pointing away, never shifting to indicate another death because Margaret's death remains incomplete, remains predicted, remains the active prediction that the weather vane must track until fulfillment, and Margaret maintains her vigil beneath the iron rooster that points toward her and will point toward her until she completes the dying it indicated, until she transitions from the living, dying state to fully dead, until the prediction becomes past tense, until the weather vane can shift and point toward the next death in another direction, releasing Margaret finally into the death she's been approaching since March 2021, when preparation for death became death itself, when accepting mortality froze mortality in place. When the weather vane pointed to Margaret Finley and found a death that would take years instead of hours, a dying that persists across time, a prediction that became reality slowly by being acknowledged, and the weather vane remains pointed at the farmhouse outside Elkins where Margaret lives and dies simultaneously, where the iron rooster crafted by Jakob Steiner in 1892 continues indicating what it has always indicated accurately. Death in that direction, death in that location. Death approaching slowly for the woman who tried to prepare for it and discovered that preparation is participation, that accepting death invites it to stay, that the weather vane's pointing isn't prediction but invitation, and Margaret accepted. And the invitation remains open, and the death continues approaching, and the weather vane points steady toward the farmhouse where dying happens slowly in the mountains of West Virginia, where iron remembers what it was forged to remember and points toward what it was forged to indicate and never stops pointing until the indication is fulfilled completely. And Margaret waits beneath that pointing, living her extended death, existing in the duration between the weather vane's aim and the final stillness it predicts. And she'll continue waiting until the prediction completes, until the dying finishes, until the weather vane shifts and points elsewhere. And Margaret Finley's long death finally ends in the mountains where iron crafted by a German blacksmith over a century ago continues its work, pointing toward deaths, indicating mortality, marking the living who will soon be dead. And Margaret is marked, has been marked, will remain marked until the marking becomes fact and the weather vane can shift and seek the next death waiting in another direction.